Now let's look in more detail at the trends with respect to democracy, at the expansion of democracy, and at some of the difficulties that democracy has encountered late in the period of this third wave, particularly in the period since 1999. Huntington argues in his book, The Third Wave, Global Democratization in the 20th Century, that there have been three great waves of democratic expansion in the world. A wave of democracy is a period of time, by his definition, in which the transitions to democracy greatly and sustainably outnumber transitions from democracy to authoritarian rule. A reverse wave is a period of time when the breakdowns of democracy, the transitions away from democracy, significantly outnumber transitions to democracy. So Huntington identifies first a very long wave of democratization over about a century, from the late 1820s to the mid-1920s, when democracy was very gradually expanding through mainly incremental reforms, with the widening of the democratic practice in the first democracy, the United States, a